billionaire's empire was collapsing, until a maid's 12-year-old daughter stood up in court and declared, "I can defend him." In the silence of a federal courtroom, a voice rose that no one expected. "I can defend him." Heads turned. Standing by the heavy oak doors was a girl, Abigail Miller, no more than 12 years old. The defendant, billionaire Harrison Cole, stared in disbelief. His high-priced lawyer had abandoned him, and now his fate rested on the maid's daughter. The prosecutor scoffed. "This is an absolute circus." But the child didn't flinch. With steady eyes, she declared, "I've read the case files. You're looking at the wrong battlefield." The room fell silent. What could a child possibly know about a case that had destroyed seasoned attorneys? This is the story of how a maid's kid saved a billionaire after his lawyer abandoned him in court. "I can defend him." The voice, clear as a small bell, cut through the heavy silence of the federal courtroom. Every head turned, every pair of eyes searching for the source of the impossible declaration. At the very back, standing by the heavy oak doors, was a girl who looked like she had taken a wrong turn on her way to a school field trip. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she clutched the worn straps of a faded pink backpack to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. The defendant, billionaire industrialist Harrison Cole, stared at her from the defense table. His face, already pale from the day's disaster, twisted into a mask of disbelief and fury. His high-priced lawyer, the man who was supposed to be his shield, had simply not shown up. The whispers said he'd fled the country, taking a hefty retainer with him and leaving Mr. Cole to face charges of corporate espionage and fraud that could cost him his entire empire and his freedom. A ripple of laughter started in the press gallery. It grew louder, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the cavernous room. "Who is that?" someone hissed. "It's Susan's kid," another voice answered. "The cleaning lady's daughter." The laughter swelled. The judge, a stern, gray-haired man named Arthur Wallace, banged his gavel, but his own expression was one of pure astonishment. "Order! Order in the court!" Harrison Cole buried his face in his hands. This was it. The end of everything. Not with a bang, but with a joke. A child standing up to defend him in a case that had chewed up and spat out some of the best legal minds in the country. The girl, however, did not flinch. She took a small, steadying breath and took one step forward. Her blue eyes, serious and unervingly calm, were fixed on the judge. "Excuse me, young lady," Judge Wallace said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Did you say something?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice small but firm. "I said I can defend him." "Mr. Cole." The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman named Brenda Reed, stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an absolute circus. The defense is clearly making a mockery of this court." "I am not," the girl said, turning her gaze to Ms. Reed. The simple, direct contradiction seemed to throw the prosecutor off balance. Harrison Cole finally looked up, his eyes burning with humiliation. "You," he snarled, his voice a low growl that carried across the room. "You should be at home playing with dolls, not standing in a federal courtroom. Get her out of here." More laughter erupted. Someone in the back muttered, "Next they'll have the janitor delivering the closing argument." But Judge Wallace held up a hand, his curiosity apparently getting the better of his judicial temper. He leaned forward, peering over his spectacles at the small figure by the door. "What is your name, child?" "Abigail Miller, Your Honor. People call me Abby." "And Abby," the judge continued, a faint, incredulous smile playing on his lips, "what makes you think you can defend a man in a multi-billion-dollar fraud case?" "I've read the case files, sir," she said simply. "The ones Mr. Cole's old lawyer threw in the recycling bin at the estate. My mother, Susan, she's the housekeeper. I found them." Brenda Reed scoffed. She read the files. "Your Honor, this is wasting everyone's time." "And what did you make of these files, Abby?" the judge asked, ignoring the prosecutor. Abby's expression grew serious. "I think you're looking at the wrong battlefield," she said. The courtroom fell silent. The odd phrasing, so out of place coming from a child, caught everyone's attention. "The wrong battlefield?" Judge Wallace repeated, leaning closer to his microphone. "Yes, Your Honor. My grandfather was General James Miller. They called him Iron Jim in the Army. My mom listens to his audiobooks all the time while she works. He always said, 'Never fight the battle your enemy expects you to fight. Find the one they don't know they're in. A few people in the gallery murmured. The name General James Miller still carried weight in certain circles. A legendary strategist. A war hero. Abby continued, her voice gaining confidence. Ms. Reed is attacking Mr. Cole on the final contract with Titan Corporation. She says he forged the signatures. That's the main battle. But the war was already lost before that. It was lost in the supply lines. Harrison Cole, who had been ready to demand she be removed, slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the girl, truly looked at her for the first time. What do you mean, supply lines? The judge asked, his tone now stripped of all mockery. He was genuinely intrigued. The email server logs, Your Honor, Abby said, shifting the weight of her backpack. And the expense reports from Mr. Cole's personal assistant, a man named Peter Finch. For 6 months before the contract was signed, Mr. Finch was meeting with someone from Titan Corporation. He was filing for meals at restaurants, but the locations were right next to Titan's headquarters. He was buying them coffee. He was leaking information. He was the one who weakened the defenses from the inside. The forged signature wasn't the first shot. It was the last one, fired at a man who was already surrounded. A stunned hush fell over the room. Brenda Reed's jaw was tight. She quickly checked her notes, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was a detail, a small one, buried in thousands of pages of discovery documents. It was background noise, not a central point of her case. The judge stared at Abby for a long, silent moment. The laughter was gone. The scoffing had vanished. In its place was a heavy, uncertain respect. He looked at Harrison Cole, a man abandoned and cornered. He looked at the prosecutor, momentarily flustered. And he looked at the little girl in the back of the room, who spoke of federal fraud in the language of military strategy. Ms. Reed, the judge said finally, as Mr. Cole's counsel has failed to appear, and as he is currently without any representation, the court is in a difficult position. I am inclined to grant a continuance. He paused, tapping his pen on his desk. However, under my strict supervision, and for the purpose of this preliminary hearing only, I will permit Miss Miller to speak on Mr. Cole's behalf. Your Honor, Brenda Reed exclaimed, aghast. My ruling is final, Judge Wallace said, his voice firm. Mr. Cole, do you agree to let this child, to let Miss Abigail Miller, act as your temporary counsel? Harrison looked from the judge to the small girl. He felt like a man drowning, and someone had just thrown him a child's pool floaty. It was absurd. It was humiliating. But it was also the only thing in the room that wasn't actively trying to sink him. He stared at Abby, at her clear, unwavering eyes. He gave a slow, defeated nod. Fine, he croaked, his voice raw. Let the girl talk. Abby walked forward, her small sneakers making no sound on the polished floor. She moved past the empty defense chair and stood beside Harrison Cole, placing her worn pink backpack on the gleaming table. She looked, impossibly, like she belonged there. That evening, Abby sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table in their cramped apartment. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant from her mother's cleaning supplies. Susan Miller paced back and forth, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. I don't understand, Abby. I don't understand how you did that. Talking about battlefields and supply lines. That's just stories Grandpa used to tell. They're not just stories, Mom, Abby said, looking up from a piece of paper she was sketching on. Grandpa said strategy is a way of seeing. It's about patterns. The case is a big pattern. Everyone is looking at the messy part in the middle. I'm just looking at the edges. Susan stopped pacing and sank into a chair opposite her daughter. Her face was pale with worry. The medical bills were piled on the counter, a mountain of paper that seemed to grow every week. Her husband, Abby's father, had passed away 2 years ago after a long illness that had drained their savings and left them with a debt that felt like a prison sentence. Working at the Cole estate was the only thing keeping them afloat. Harrison Cole looked at you like you were some kind of ghost, Susan murmured. First angry, then, I don't know, confused. He's used to people being afraid of him, Abby said. I'm not afraid. He's just a person who is in a lot of trouble. But, honey, they're dangerous people. The ones suing him, Titan Corporation. Mr. Cole always said their CEO, Marcus Thorne, was a snake. Grandpa said you never fear a snake, Abby replied, not looking up from her drawing. You just learn where it's going to strike and make sure you're not standing there. Her drawing wasn't a doodle. It was a map. She had drawn the main players as different colored circles. Cole was blue. Thorn was red. She drew lines between them, labeling them with things like contract, media, and witnesses. But then she drew a smaller, gray circle off to the side. Peter Finch, the assistant. From that gray circle, she had drawn a dotted line, not to Cole, but directly to Thorn. "This is where we have to look," Abby said, tapping the gray circle. Peter Finch didn't just disappear. People like him don't disappear. They go somewhere. The next morning, Abby insisted they go to the Cole estate. Not to clean, but to investigate. Harrison Cole met them in his grand library. He hadn't slept. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and he looked smaller, less imposing, amidst the towering shelves of leather-bound books. "I still don't know what to think about yesterday," he said, his voice raspy. He didn't offer them a seat. "We need to get into Peter Finch's old office," Abby said, ignoring his comment. Cole raised an eyebrow. "It's been cleared out. He resigned a month before. All of this. People always leave something behind," Abby stated, with the certainty of a seasoned detective. Reluctantly, Cole led them to a small, sterile office at the back of the house. It was just as he'd said, empty. The desk was clear, the drawers vacant. Susan began to apologize, but Abby walked slowly around the room, her eyes scanning everything. She ran her hand along the empty bookshelf. She knelt and looked under the desk. Then she saw it. A small, metal trash can in the corner. It was empty, except for a single, crumpled piece of paper at the bottom. She smoothed it out. It was a page from a legal pad, covered in doodles. In the middle of a series of mindless swirls and boxes, there was a sketch. It was a crude drawing of a bridge, and beneath it, a sequence of 4 numbers, 4815. "What is that?" Cole asked, peering over her shoulder. "I don't know yet," Abby said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "But he drew it for a reason. Grandpa always said to pay attention to the things people throw away. That's where they hide the truth." That night, a call came. It was a block number. Susan answered, putting the phone on speaker as Abby had instructed. A man's voice, low and distorted, came through the line. "You're the maid," the voice rasped. "Your daughter was very loud in court. Some people don't like loud children. Tell her to go back to playing with her toys. It would be a shame if she got hurt playing in a grown-up's game." The line went dead. Susan's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. The medical bills on the counter suddenly seemed insignificant. This was a different kind of danger. Abby, however, simply took the crumpled drawing and pinned it to the corkboard in their kitchen. Her face was set with a grim determination that did not belong on a 12-year-old. "They're scared," she whispered, more to herself than to her terrified mother. "Good. Now we know where to push." She stared at the drawing of the bridge. It looked familiar. She had seen it somewhere before, on a school trip or in a book. It was a local landmark. And the numbers, they weren't random. Her grandfather had taught her about military codes, about how soldiers used simple keys to remember complex information. She pulled out her laptop and started searching. She looked up images of local bridges. After 10 minutes, she found it. The Westchester Arch Bridge, an old stone structure over a quiet creek about 30 miles north. Then she searched for storage facilities near the bridge. One name popped up, Archway Private Storage. "Mom," Abby said, her voice calm and steady. "I think I know where Peter Finch left his ammunition." The next day in court, Brenda Reed came out swinging. She presented phone records, emails, and expert testimony that all seemed to point directly at Harrison Cole. She painted a picture of a desperate man, a titan of industry whose empire was crumbling, who forged a rival's signature to save himself. The mood in the room was grim. Harrison sat like a stone, his face impassive, but Abby could see the tension in his hands, clasped tightly on the table. When it was her turn, Abby didn't try to refute the evidence directly. She simply stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, Ms. Reed has built a very strong fortress. From the outside, it looks like it cannot be broken. But Grandpa said that every fortress has a secret door. It's usually the one that everyone ignores." She then began to ask the witness, a handwriting expert, a series of strange questions. Not about the signature, but about the ink. Is it possible that the signature was applied with a modern digital pen that can replicate pressure and style? The expert conceded it was possible. And is it possible to fake the timestamp on a digital document? Again, he had to agree. She wasn't winning, not really. She was just poking small holes in the walls. Brenda Reed was smirking. Your Honor, Abby said, turning back to the judge. The prosecution's case is based on a single document. A document that we believe was created to be a distraction, a loud noise to keep everyone from looking in the right place. And where's the right place, Miss Miller? Judge Wallace asked, his expression unreadable. Abby took a deep breath. It's in a storage locker. Unit 4815, at a facility 30 miles from here. I believe that's where the real war was planned. Brenda Reed burst out laughing. A storage locker? This is her defense? Your Honor, I move to have this entire line of argument stricken. It is pure fantasy. The judge looked at Abby, his eyes thoughtful. Do you have any proof to support this theory? Not yet, sir, Abby admitted. But we will. The judge looked from Abby to the prosecutor and then to the silent, grim-faced billionaire. The court will recess for 24 hours, he declared, banging his gavel. And I am issuing a court order to unseal the contents of storage unit 4815 at the Archway Private Storage Facility. We will see if Miss Miller's fantasy has any basis in reality. As they left the courtroom, Harrison Cole walked beside Abby. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, as they reached the marble steps outside, he stopped and looked down at her. Your grandfather, he said, his voice quiet. He must have been a remarkable man. He was, Abby said. He believed that the truth was the most powerful weapon in the world, and that it doesn't matter how small you are. If you're holding the truth, you're the strongest one in the room. The drive to the storage facility was a silent, tense affair. A court-appointed bailiff drove the black sedan, with Abby in the passenger seat and Harrison Cole in the back. Cole hadn't said a word since they left the courthouse. He just stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly image against the passing blur of trees and buildings. He was a man adrift, his fate now tethered to the improbable intuition of a 12-year-old girl. Abby, for her part, was calm. She held the crumpled drawing in her lap, studying the crude sketch of the bridge as if it were a treasure map. To her it was. Her grandfather had taught her that wars weren't won with brute force, but with information. And she was certain that Peter Finch, a man clearly skilled in deception, would have kept his most valuable information somewhere safe, somewhere disconnected from the digital trails that investigators always followed. The Archway Private Storage Facility was a drab, gray building set back from a quiet country road. The manager, a portly man with a sweat-stained shirt, met them at the gate, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement at the sight of the official court vehicle. He led them through a maze of identical-looking corridors, the air cool and smelling faintly of dust and concrete. They stopped in front of Unit 4815. The bailiff produced a heavy pair of bolt cutters and, with a loud snap, severed the thick padlock. The metal door rattled upwards, revealing a small, dark space. It was almost empty. For a heart-stopping moment, Abby felt a surge of panic. Had she been wrong? Was this all just a wild goose chase, a child's fantasy as Brenda Reed had claimed? In the center of the 10-by-10-foot space sat a single, small, fireproof safe. Cole let out a long, slow breath. Of course, he muttered. Finch always was a paranoid man. The bailiff looked at the safe. We'll need a warrant to open that, and a locksmith. No, we won't, Abby said quietly. She walked into the locker and knelt before the safe. It had a simple 4-digit combination dial. She looked back at the crumpled paper in her hand. 4815, the unit number. It was too obvious. Finch was smarter than that. She thought about her grandfather's lessons. Codes aren't about complexity, he used to say. They're about memory. People use what they know, what they see every day. Mr. Cole, Abby said, not taking her eyes off the dial. When was Peter Finch's birthday? Cole blinked, taken aback. I have no idea. Sometime in the spring, I think. April. What about his service anniversary with the company? June, maybe? I don't remember the exact date. Abby's mind raced. It had to be something simple, something Finch would see often enough to remember, but that no one else would think was significant. She looked again at the drawing. The bridge. The Westchester Arch Bridge. She remembered the plaque she'd seen on her school trip. It had a date on it. The year the bridge was built. She pulled out her phone and did a quick search. Westchester Arch Bridge, constructed 1927. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the dial. Right to 19. Left past 19 to 27. She pulled the handle. With a heavy, satisfying click, the safe opened. Inside, There was a single laptop computer and a thick manila envelope. The bailiff, looking stunned, took possession of the items to be entered into evidence. As they walked back to the car, Harrison Cole finally broke his silence. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "The date. How could you possibly have known that?" "It wasn't about knowing," Abby said, buckling her seatbelt. "It was about thinking like Mr. Finch. He hid the key to his secrets in plain sight. He just counted on no one being willing to look at the picture he drew and see more than just a doodle." Back in the courtroom the next day, the atmosphere was electric. The laptop and the contents of the envelope had been analyzed by the court's forensic team. Judge Wallace sat at the bench, his expression stern, as Brenda Reed was forced to present the new evidence. The laptop contained a hidden, encrypted partition. Once unlocked, it revealed a complete shadow ledger of Peter Finch's activities. For over a year, he had been systematically selling Harrison Cole's trade secrets to Titan Corporation. There were emails, audio recordings of meetings with Marcus Thorne's subordinates, and copies of bank transfers to an offshore account. He had been the mole, the saboteur who had crippled Cole Industries from within. The manila envelope contained the masterstroke. It held the original, unsigned contract with Titan Corporation. But it also held something else, a set of high-resolution digital scans of Marcus Thorne's signature, taken from dozens of other documents. Peter Finch, in a final act of betrayal, had not only framed his boss, but had also kept the very tool used to do it. He had used a sophisticated program to piece together a flawless forgery, a digital cut-and-paste job so perfect that it had fooled every expert who had examined it. The case against Harrison Cole evaporated like smoke. Brenda Reed, her face ashen, had no choice but to drop all charges. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Harrison Cole sat at the defense table, not with triumph, but with a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had won, but he had come terrifyingly close to losing everything. He looked at Abby, who was quietly packing her worn backpack, and felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a very long time: genuine gratitude. As they were leaving, a man in a sharp suit intercepted them in the corridor. "Mr. Cole, a word?" Cole recognized him instantly. It was Marcus Thorne's lawyer. "What do you want?" Cole asked, his voice cold. "Mr. Thorne extends his apologies for this unfortunate misunderstanding," the lawyer said smoothly. "He was as much a victim of Mr. Finch's deception as you were. He has already begun proceedings to sue Finch for damages. It was a blatant, transparent lie. Thorne was cutting his losses, sacrificing his pawn to save himself." Cole was about to unleash a torrent of angry words, but Abby stepped forward. "Tell Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady, "that my grandfather always said that when you find one rat in the barn, you don't stop looking until you've found the nest." The lawyer's smug expression faltered. He stared at the little girl, a flicker of genuine alarm in his eyes, before turning and walking away without another word. Harrison Cole looked down at Abby, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile. "I think your grandfather and I would have gotten along very well," he said. That evening, Harrison Cole insisted on driving Abby and her mother home. He pulled his gleaming black Bentley up to their modest apartment building, the car looking like a spaceship that had landed on a foreign planet. "Susan," he said, turning to Abby's mother in the passenger seat, "I owe you and your daughter more than I can ever repay. I know about your medical debts. I want you to consider them paid. In full." Susan burst into tears, a flood of relief and disbelief washing over her. "Mr. Cole, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "And Abby," he continued, turning to the back seat, "I have a proposition for you. I have a foundation, a charitable trust that I've neglected for years. It's meant to fund educational programs, scholarships for gifted children. I want you to run it." Abby's eyes widened. "Run it? But I'm only 12. "You have a mind that sees things others miss," Cole said, his voice completely serious. "A perspective that is more valuable than a dozen Ivy League degrees. I'll handle the legal and financial side, of course, but I want you to choose where the money goes. I want you to find the other kids out there like you, the ones who see the world differently, and give them the resources they need. Think of it as your new battlefield." Abby looked at her mother, who was staring at her with tears of pride in her eyes. She thought about her grandfather, about his belief in strategy and truth. This was a different kind of war, a war fought not with soldiers and guns, but with opportunity and knowledge. Okay, Abby said, a small smile touching her lips. I'll do it. A month later, Abby stood in a gleaming new office on the top floor of the coal industries building. The view of the city was breathtaking. On her desk was a plaque that read, Abigail Miller, Executive Director, the Coal Foundation. Her mother worked there too, as the head of community outreach, her days of cleaning houses behind her forever. The foundation's first project was a massive investment in public school libraries, equipping them with state-of-the-art technology and resources. Abby personally vetted every proposal, her strategic mind finding the patterns, identifying the schools where the investment would have the greatest impact. One afternoon, Harrison Cole walked into her office, holding a newspaper. Have you seen this? He asked, pointing to a small article on the business page. Titan Corp stock plummets amidst internal investigation. Marcus Thorne's carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble from the inside out, just as Cole's had almost done. The seeds of distrust that Abby had planted had taken root. Good, Abby said, not looking up from the school funding proposal she was reading. A structure built on lies will always collapse. Cole watched her for a moment. This extraordinary child who had saved him. He had been a king in a castle of glass, and she had not only stopped the stones being thrown at him, but had shown him how to rebuild with something stronger. You know, he said thoughtfully, Peter Finch was eventually found. He was hiding out in a small country with no extradition treaty. But the money he stole? It was gone. The offshore bank account had been completely emptied. Abby finally looked up, a faint, knowing smile on her face. Grandpa always said the most important part of any victory is securing the enemy's resources. Cole's eyes widened in stunned realization. He remembered the laptop, the brief moments it was in Abby's possession before the bailiff had taken it. He had assumed she was just looking for evidence. But she had been doing more. She had seen the bank account information and, with a few keystrokes, had not only defeated her enemy but had defunded him, rerouting the stolen millions into an anonymous international relief fund. She hadn't just won the battle. She had won the war, and she had done it so quietly, so completely, that no one had even known she was fighting. He looked at the small, blonde-haired girl who was already absorbed back in her work, shaping the future, and understood. He hadn't just been saved by the maid's daughter. He had been saved by a general, a worthy successor to Iron Jim Miller. And her campaign had only just begun. 6 months passed. The Coal Foundation, under Abby's unorthodox leadership, became a quiet force of nature in the city. It didn't just write checks, it conducted campaigns. Abby treated every grant application, every scholarship request, like a miniature battlefield. She deployed resources with the precision of a general, focusing on areas of highest potential impact, or what she called strategic leverage points. Her office became the Foundation's war room. One wall was covered in a massive map of the city, marked with colored pins. Red pins for underfunded schools, blue for community centers and high-crime neighborhoods, yellow for families struggling with medical debt. She saw them not as problems to be pitted, but as territories to be won back. Harrison Cole found himself revitalized. After years of navigating the cutthroat world of corporate takeovers, he found Abby's brand of philanthropy to be exhilarating. He was her quartermaster, securing the resources, navigating the bureaucracy, and running interference with the board of directors, who were initially skeptical of taking orders from a 12-year-old. They're concerned about the optics of the new First Principles grant, Harrison said, walking into her office one morning. He held a tablet displaying a sternly worded email from a board member. They think giving unrestricted funds directly to families is fiscally irresponsible. Abby was studying a set of blueprints for a playground. Tell them Grandpa said that you can't win a war by committee, she said without looking up. And tell them that people aren't fiscal liabilities. They're the frontline troops. If you don't give your soldiers the supplies they need, the whole army collapses. The First Principles grant was Abby's latest initiative. It identified families on the brink of financial collapse due to a single catastrophic event, a medical emergency, a sudden job loss. Instead of offering loans or complicated aid packages, the foundation gave them a one-time, no-strings-attached grant sufficient to clear their immediate debts. The board saw it as a handout. Abby saw it as reinforcing a critical defensive line. They want a report, Harrison pressed gently. Data. Proof of concept. Fine, Abby said, finally turning from the blueprints. She pointed to a stack of letters on the corner of her desk. There's your data. Harrison picked up the top letter. It was from a woman named Maria Sanchez. Her husband, a construction worker, had been injured on the job, and the medical bills had been ruinous. They were days from being evicted. The foundation's grant had not only saved their home, but had given her husband the time he needed to recover without the crushing stress of their debt. He was now back at work. Their son, who had been on the verge of dropping out of school to get a job, was now on the honor roll. This isn't a financial report, Abby, Harrison said, though his voice was soft. It's better, she replied. It's a field report from a successful mission. We didn't just save a family, we defended a position. That boy, the one on the honor roll, he wants to be an engineer. In 10 years, he might be building a bridge or a hospital. That's our return on investment. It's just on a longer timeline than the board is used to looking at. Harrison smiled. I'll handle the board, he said, and he did. While Abby fought her new war, the old one still had echoes. Marcus Thorne had all but disappeared from public life. Titan Corp was a ghost of its former self, carved up and sold for parts. But Abby knew men like Thorne didn't simply accept defeat. They retreated, regrouped, and looked for a new angle of attack. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A series of negative articles began appearing in the gossip columns and online blogs. They painted Harrison Cole as a reclusive eccentric, a puppet master being controlled by a child prodigy with a messiah complex. They twisted the foundation's work, portraying the First Principles grant as a reckless scheme to throw money away. Susan, whose role in community outreach made her the foundation's eyes and ears on the ground, felt the impact first. The Sanchez family, their landlord is trying to find a way to evict them again, she told Abby and Harrison one evening, her face etched with worry. He read one of those articles. He thinks they're sitting on a pile of cash. Other families are being harassed, asked for money by neighbors. The stories are turning our help into a target on their backs. Abby stood in front of her map, her expression grim. This is an information campaign, she said. It's meant to turn the public against us, to isolate our allies. It's Thorne's move. He can't attack us directly, so he's poisoning the battlefield. How do we fight back? Harrison asked, his jaw tight with anger. We can sue for libel, but it's a slow, ugly process. No, Abby said, shaking her head. Grandpa said you never fight a swamp by wrestling with the mud. You drain the swamp. She walked over to her desk and pulled out a file. It was thick and filled with notes she had been compiling for months. We don't respond to their stories. We tell a bigger one. The plan was audacious. Instead of issuing press releases or fighting with bloggers, Abby proposed a documentary. A series of short, professionally produced films, released online, telling the real stories of the families the foundation had helped. Not just the Sanchez family, but dozens of others. The teacher who could afford her mother's cancer treatments. The veteran who got a new prosthetic leg. The single mother who was able to leave an abusive relationship. Harrison loved it. He immediately hired the best documentary film crew in the country. The project became Abby's primary focus. She wasn't just directing. She was interviewing, scouting locations, and shaping the narrative. She had an innate understanding of the emotional core of each story, of how to capture the quiet dignity of people who had been pushed to the edge and had found a way back. The first film, The Sanchez Story, was released 3 weeks later. It was simple, quiet, and devastatingly effective. It showed the family in their small, clean apartment. It showed Mr. Sanchez's worn work boots by the door. It showed his son at the kitchen table, struggling with an algebra problem, his father patiently helping him. In a soft-spoken interview, Maria Sanchez talked not about money, but about the relief of being able to sleep through the night without fear. The film went viral. It was shared millions of times. It didn't just counter the narrative of the gossip blogs. It made them look petty and cruel. The negative articles stopped almost overnight. Donations poured into the foundation from all over the world. Abby had not just drained the swamp. She had irrigated a desert and shown everyone the beautiful things that could grow there. In the midst of this success, a new piece of the past emerged. A letter arrived at the foundation addressed to Abby. It was from a military archivist. He had been cataloging General James Iron Jim Miller's personal effects, which had recently been donated by the Army, and had found something he thought Abby should have. A week later, a package arrived. Inside was a heavy, leather-bound journal. It was her grandfather's. The pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary of his feelings, but a record of his thoughts on strategy, history, and leadership. Abby spent hours with the journal. It felt like having a conversation with him. She read his analysis of famous battles, his critiques of other generals, his thoughts on the nature of conflict and resolution. On one of the last pages, she found an entry that made her stop. October 12th. Met a young man today. Harrison Cole, son of an old friend. He's sharp, ambitious, but he sees the world as a series of targets to be conquered. He wins, but he leaves a trail of resentment in his wake. A victory that creates a dozen new enemies is no victory at all. It's just the prelude to the next war. I tried to tell him that the greatest strength isn't in the attack, but in the alliance. In building something that people will fight to defend. I'm not sure he understood. Abby closed the journal, her heart pounding. Her grandfather had known Harrison Cole. He had seen the flaw in him, the very flaw that had left him isolated and vulnerable when Marcus Thorne had made his move. And in a way, her grandfather had laid the groundwork for her own strategy. She wasn't just cleaning up Harrison's messes. She was finishing her grandfather's work. She was teaching this old corporate raider how to build alliances, how to create something people would rally behind. The foundation wasn't just a charity. It was the fortress her grandfather knew Harrison needed. She took the journal and walked into Harrison's office. He was on the phone, his voice sharp and commanding as he negotiated a deal for a piece of property the foundation wanted for a new community center. He looked up and saw the look on her face, and his tone immediately softened. "I'll call you back," he said, hanging up the phone. "What is it, Abby? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way," she said. She opened the journal and placed it on his desk, turning it to the final entry. "I think you need to read this." Harrison read the passage. He read it once, then twice. The color drained from his face. He sank back into his chair, the memory of that long-ago conversation suddenly clear in his mind. He had dismissed the old general's advice as the ramblings of a man who didn't understand the modern world. And now, that general's granddaughter had just saved his life by proving him right. "He tried to warn me," Harrison whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I didn't listen." "But you're listening now," Abby said softly. He looked up at her, at this impossible child who was his savior, his partner, and, he was beginning to realize, his teacher. The past and the present had collided in his office, and the future suddenly looked very different. The war against Marcus Thorne was over. The work of the foundation was just beginning, and the lessons of General Iron Jim Miller were more alive than ever. The revelation from the journal forged a new, deeper bond between Harrison and Abby. He was no longer just her benefactor. He was her student. He began to spend less time in the corporate boardroom and more in the foundation's war room, learning to see the city not as a marketplace of assets and liabilities, but as a complex human ecosystem. He learned to read Abby's maps, to understand her strategies, and to appreciate the profound, quiet power of a targeted act of kindness. Their success, however, did not go unnoticed. And in the world Harrison Cole had inhabited for decades, success always invited challenges. The new threat did not come from the shadows, like Marcus Thorne. It came from the spotlight. Councilman Robert Morrison was a rising star in city politics. He was handsome, charismatic, and had built his career on a platform of fiscal responsibility and common-sense governance. He saw himself as a watchdog for the taxpayer's dollar, and he began to turn his scrutinizing gaze upon the Cole Foundation. It started with a press conference on the steps of City Hall. "Private philanthropy plays a role in our city," Morrison announced, his voice ringing with practiced sincerity. "But it must be a role of partnership, of transparency. What we are seeing from the Cole Foundation, however, is something different. It is a rogue state, an unaccountable shadow government, pouring millions of dollars into our communities with no oversight, no public input, and no measurable metrics for success." He never mentioned Thorne. He didn't have to. The language he used, words like unaccountable, disruptive, dangerous, was the same language from the smear campaign, now polished and legitimized by a public official. "He's good," Harrison grumbled, watching the press conference on the large screen in Abby's office. "He's making our greatest strength. Our ability to move quickly and directly sound like a weakness. Abby was quiet, her fingers steepled under her chin. She was studying Morrison, not just his words, but his posture, his gestures, the way he smiled for the cameras. Grandpa said to always understand your opponent's supply lines, she said, almost to herself. What does Councilman Morrison need to survive? Votes? Harrison answered immediately. Donors. Media attention. He's a politician. He's getting the media attention, Abby noted. So we need to look at his votes and his donors. She turned to her computer and began to dig. She didn't look at public donation records. That was too obvious. She looked for patterns, for the secondary and tertiary connections her grandfather had taught her to find. She cross-referenced Morrison's legislative proposals with the business interests of his key supporters. She mapped his political appearances against zoning changes and city contracts. For 2 days, she barely spoke, subsisting on sandwiches her mother left on her desk. Harrison left her alone, recognizing the intense concentration of a general planning a campaign. Finally, she called him into her office. She had drawn a new map on her whiteboard. At the center was Councilman Morrison. Branching off from him were lines leading to several real estate development companies. One of these companies, a shell corporation called Argent Properties, had been quietly buying up undervalued land in the very neighborhoods where the Cole Foundation was most active. Morrison's attack isn't about fiscal responsibility, Abby explained, tapping the circle that represented Argent Properties. It's a ground-clearing operation. His donors want to gentrify these neighborhoods. They want to build luxury condos. But they can't do that as long as the communities are stable. Our first principles grants, the ones that keep families in their homes, are a direct threat to their business model. Morrison's job is to discredit us, to cut off our public support, so that these people, she swept her hand across the map, indicating the families they were helping, are left vulnerable and can be pushed out. Harrison felt a cold fury rise within him. It was a classic corporate raider tactic, one he himself might have used in his previous life. Attack a company's reputation, drive down its value, then scoop up the assets for pennies on the dollar. Only this time, the assets were people's homes. And I'll bet you $1 billion, Harrison said, his voice a low growl, that if we follow the money trail from Argent Properties far enough, we'll find it leads right back to Marcus Thorne. We don't have to, Abby said. Fighting Thorne is the old war. The new war is with Councilman Morrison, and we're not going to fight him on his terms. What do you mean? We expose him, Harrison insisted. We leak this to the press. Show everyone he's a paid shill for predatory developers. No, Abby said firmly. Grandpa wrote in his journal that a direct assault on a fortified position is costly and often fails. You don't blow up the enemy's fort. You make it irrelevant. Her plan, as always, was both simple and brilliant. It was a two-pronged attack. The first prong was to fortify their own position. Abby used the documentary film crew to create a new series of shorts. But these weren't about the families. They were about the neighborhoods themselves. They were loving portraits of the communities that Morrison and his backers saw only as lines on a zoning map. They showed the block parties, the small businesses, the community gardens, the vibrant life that existed there. The films were a celebration, a powerful statement that these were not blighted areas in need of demolition, but living communities worthy of defense. The second prong was the counteroffensive. It was an idea so audacious that even Harrison was taken aback at first. We are going to partner with Councilman Morrison, Abby announced. Harrison stared at her. I'm sorry. I thought you just said we were going to partner with the man who is actively trying to destroy us. Exactly, Abby said, a glint in her eye. We are going to publicly praise him for his commitment to fiscal responsibility. We're going to agree that there should be more oversight. And then, we're going to propose the creation of a new, independent community investment board. She laid out the details. The board would be made up of residents from the targeted neighborhoods, local business owners, and financial experts. The Cole Foundation would provide the initial funding, a massive, multi-million-dollar grant, but the board would have complete autonomy over how it was spent. They would approve projects, vet proposals, and ensure the money went directly to strengthening the community from within. And, Abby said, delivering the final, brilliant stroke, we will ask Councilman Morrison to co-chair the selection committee for this new board. We will force him to be publicly involved in its creation. Harrison began to laugh. The sheer, beautiful, strategic genius of it was breathtaking. It was a trap made of goodwill. If Morrison refused, he would look like a hypocrite, a man who talked about oversight but ran from it when it was offered. If he accepted, he would be forced to help create the very structure that would permanently block his donors from achieving their goals. He would be an active participant in his own defeat. They launched the campaign. They released the community films, which were met with an outpouring of local pride and support. Then they held their own press conference, formally announcing the proposal for the Community Investment Board and publicly extending the invitation to Councilman Morrison. Morrison was caught completely off guard. He was trapped. On live television, with reporters shouting questions, he had no choice. "Of course," he said, his smile looking pasted on. "I would be honored to participate." The battle was over. Morrison's attack had been neutralized, his power co-opted. The community board was formed, a permanent shield against the developers. And Argent Properties quietly began selling off its land holdings at a loss. In the aftermath, Harrison sat in Abby's office, watching her update her city map. She was replacing the red pins in one neighborhood with green ones, marking it as a fortified position. "I never would have thought of that," he admitted. "My first and only instinct would have been to find Thorne's money and burn Morrison to the ground with it." "That's because you still think in terms of destroying your enemy," Abby said, placing the last green pin. "Grandpa taught me that the ultimate victory isn't destroying your enemy. It's convincing your enemy to help you build your world." She turned from the map and looked at him, her expression serious. "We have to be better than them, Harrison. We can't just win. We have to be worthy of the victory." It was in that moment that Harrison Cole finally, fully understood the lesson that General Miller had tried to teach him all those years ago. Victory wasn't a transaction. It wasn't about conquering territory or crushing an opponent. It was about building something that would last. A legacy. And his, he now knew, would not be the skyscrapers he had built or the companies he had acquired. It would be the little girl with the mind of a general and the heart of a true leader who had taught an old warrior a new way to fight. He thought about the future, not in terms of fiscal quarters, but in generations. He saw the foundation growing, the community boards spreading across the city, a network of fortified, self-sufficient neighborhoods, immune to the predators who saw people as profit margins. And at the center of it all, he saw Abby, not a child playing a grown-up's game, but a visionary building a better, kinder, and more just world. It was a world he was now proud to be a part of, not as a king, but as a humble soldier in her army. The years that followed were a period of quiet, steady construction. The Cole Foundation, guided by Abby's strategic vision and Harrison's resources, became a pillar of the city. The community investment boards flourished, creating a network of empowered neighborhoods that were resilient to the predatory forces of unchecked gentrification. Abby, now a teenager, navigated her unique life with a calm confidence that belied her age. She attended a regular high school during the day, her backpack filled with textbooks on algebra and history, and spent her afternoons in the Foundation's war room, her mind filled with strategies for social and economic justice. Harrison, for his part, had found a sense of purpose that had eluded him during his entire corporate career. He was no longer the lone wolf, the ruthless raider. He was a builder, a guardian. He found more satisfaction in approving a grant for a new public library than he ever had in a hostile takeover. He and Abby had become an inseparable team, a strange but powerful partnership of age and youth, experience and vision. The final test of their alliance, and of the fortress they had built, came not from a corporate rival or a corrupt politician, but from within. It came in the form of a letter from the Internal Revenue Service. The audit was unexpected and brutally thorough. A team of stone-faced agents descended upon the Foundation, demanding years of records, questioning every grant, scrutinizing every expenditure. It was a siege of a different kind, fought not on the streets or in the press, but in the sterile language of tax codes and financial regulations. Harrison was furious. He saw it as a politically motivated attack, a last-ditch effort by the remnants of Morrison's old network to cripple them with bureaucracy. "This is a weaponized audit," he raged, pacing in Abby's office. "They'll tie us up in red tape for years. They'll bleed us dry with legal fees. We have to fight them. I'll hire the best tax attorneys in the country. We'll take this all the way to the Supreme Court if we have to." Abby, now 16, sat calmly at her desk, reviewing the initial audit findings. She had the same look of intense focus she'd had when she first analyzed Harrison's fraud case all those years ago. "Fighting them is what they expect," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's the battle they've prepared for. Remember what Grandpa said? Never fight the battle your enemy expects you to fight. This isn't a battlefield, Abby, it's the IRS." Harrison retorted, exasperated. "You can't out-strategize a federal audit." "Why not?" she asked, looking up at him. "It's just another system, with rules and patterns and weaknesses. They're looking for financial irregularities. They're expecting us to hide, to defend, to obscure. So, we'll do the opposite. We will give them radical transparency." Her plan was, as always, deceptively simple. She proposed they not only comply with the audit, but that they go a step further. They would open up everything. They would invite the lead auditor, a notoriously thorough and uncompromising woman named Ms. Evelyn Reed, to personally visit the communities they had helped. "An attorney will just argue about the interpretation of Section 501(c)(3), Abby explained. "We need to show them the meaning behind the numbers. We need to turn their greatest weapon, scrutiny, into our own." Harrison was deeply skeptical, but he had learned to trust Abby's instincts. He agreed. Ms. Reed, a woman who seemed to be made entirely of sharp angles and gray suits, arrived with a team of junior agents, her expression one of deep suspicion. She clearly expected a fight, a flurry of legal objections, and carefully curated presentations. Instead, Abby and Harrison greeted her personally. "We've cleared our schedules for the week, Ms. Reed," Abby said politely. "We want to give you a tour." They didn't take her to their gleaming headquarters. They took her to the Sanchez family's neighborhood. They walked her through the community garden that had been funded by a foundation grant. They introduced her to Maria Sanchez, who spoke with quiet pride about her son's acceptance into a pre-engineering program at a top university. They took her to the new wing of the local health clinic, built with funds from the Community Investment Board that Abby had created. The head doctor showed Ms. Reed the patient records, demonstrating a measurable decline in emergency room visits for preventable illnesses since the clinic had expanded its services. They walked her down streets that were clean and safe, past small businesses that were thriving, into the library that was packed with children. At every stop, they provided the corresponding financial data. "This is the grant. This is where the money went. And this is the result." They weren't just showing her charity. They were showing her a functioning, thriving economic and social ecosystem that they had helped to build and fortify. Ms. Reed was silent for most of the tour, her face unreadable. She asked sharp, pointed questions, but her tone began to shift. The suspicion was slowly being replaced by a grudging curiosity. The turning point came on the third day. They visited a small community center that ran an after-school program. The center was in danger of closing before the foundation had stepped in. Inside, a group of teenagers were working on a robotics project. One of them, a bright-eyed girl named Sophia, eagerly explained their work to Ms. Reed, her hands moving excitedly as she pointed out the complex wiring of their robot. "We're going to the state championships next month," Sophia said, beaming. "Before, we didn't even have enough money for textbooks. Now I think I can be an engineer." Later, as they were leaving, Ms. Reed paused on the sidewalk. She looked at the children playing in the newly renovated park across the street. "My job is to ensure that nonprofits are not abusing their tax-exempt status," she said, her voice softer than they had ever heard it. "I am trained to see the potential for fraud in every line of a budget. I look at a grant for an after-school program, and I see a potential kickback to the director. I see inflated invoices for supplies. That's how I'm trained to see the world." She turned to Abby. "You've shown me something else. You've shown me the asset side of the ledger. You've shown me the return on investment that doesn't appear on any tax form." The audit concluded 2 weeks later. The foundation was cleared of any wrongdoing. In her final report, Ms. Reed included an unusual commendation, praising the Cole Foundation for its unprecedented level of transparency and its demonstrably effective model of community reinvestment. The war was over. They had faced every kind of enemy, the corporate saboteur, the political operative, the bureaucratic machine, and they had won. They had won not by destroying their opponents, but by building something so strong, so true, and so transparent that it was simply unassailable. On a warm spring evening a few weeks later, Harrison and Abby stood on the rooftop terrace of the coal industries building, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city. Down below, the lights of the neighborhoods they had fought for shone brightly. "He would have been so proud of you," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. He was holding the worn leather journal that had belonged to General Miller. "He would have been proud of you, too," Abby replied, giving him a small smile. "You finally learned how to build alliances." Harrison nodded, a lump in his throat. He looked at Abby, who was now a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. She would be going off to college soon, though she insisted on running the foundation remotely. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just the beginning for her. She would take the lessons of her grandfather, forged in the crucible of war, and the resources he had given her, and she would apply them to bigger and bigger battlefields. She would change the world, not with weapons and armies, but with strategy, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of the truth. "I can defend him," she had said, all those years ago in that courtroom, a small, blonde-haired child against the world. And she had. She had defended him. She had defended families and neighborhoods. She had defended a community. And in doing so, she had shown a cynical old billionaire and the entire city that the most powerful defense of all is not a shield or a sword, but a helping hand extended to another, building a future worth fighting for. The legacy of Iron Jim Miller was secure, passed on to a new kind of general for a new kind of war. And her campaign had only just begun. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.